All right, picture this. You're trying to figure out how a slinky goes down the stairs, but you can only see one tiny coil
Oh.
at a time. You'd be missing the bigger picture, right? That's what it's like, trying to understand events without grasping the systems they're a part of.
It's like trying to understand a joke by
It's,
only hearing the punchline.
yeah,
You might chuckle, but you're missing the setup.
exactly. And that's where our deep dive today comes in, systems thinking. We're going deep into Donella Meadows' thinking in systems to uncover the often hidden forces shaping our world.
What's remarkable about Meadows' work is that she takes these complex ideas and makes them accessible,
Good.
using everyday examples.
Okay, so then let's start with something everyone has, a thermostat. I admit I never thought I'd be talking about thermostats on the show, but here we are.
Well, a thermostat is a fantastic example of a system with competing feedback loops.
Okay.
You've got the heat warming up the room, right? That's one loop.
Right.
But then you've got the thermostat itself working to maintain a specific temperature.
Right.
That's another loop.
So it's like a constant dance-off between those two loops. Heat trying to crank things up, the thermostat trying to chill things out. What happens if one of them gets out of sync?
That's where delays in feedback loops come in, and they can really mess things up.
Oh, no.
Think about driving a car.
Okay.
You know that feeling when you overcorrect the steering wheel
Yeah.
and end up swerving?
Oh, yeah. Definitely not my smoothest driving moments.
That's a delay in a feedback loop playing out in real time.
Wow.
Your brain receives the information that the car is veering off course. But there's a slight delay between that realization,
Right.
your reaction to steer back,
Yeah.
and the car actually responding.
Wow, I never thought about it like that, but it makes perfect sense. So delays can lead to overcorrections and instability, not just in driving, but in systems in general, right?
Absolutely. Imagine a car dealership trying to manage its inventory.
Okay.
Customers are buying cars, which depletes their stock,
Right.
and they're simultaneously ordering new cars to replenish it.
Right.
But there are delays at every step.
Oh, okay.
Maybe the dealership misjudges how quickly a particular model is selling.
Sure.
Then there's the time it takes to place the order,
Right.
the time it takes for the manufacturer to build the car,
Uh-huh.
and finally, the time it takes to ship it to the dealership.
And by the time those shiny new cars arrive, the demand might have changed completely.
Precisely. And if the dealership tries to react too quickly to every little change in demand,
Yeah.
they might overcompensate, ordering way too many cars or too few,
Oh, wow.
creating even more chaos.
Wow.
This illustrates how crucial it is to understand the role of delays in how systems behave.
Okay, so delays and feedback loops can really throw a wrench in things.
They can?
What other system quirks should we be aware of?
Well, let's talk about nonlinearities, those instances where cause and effect
Okay.
aren't as straightforward as we might assume.
Okay.
It's the classic case of more of a good thing, not always being better.
Right.
Meadows uses a fascinating example.
Okay.
Spruce budworm outbreaks in forests.
Okay, now we're talking about actual worms.
Yep, these outbreaks have been happening for centuries.
Wow.
And what's intriguing is how seemingly small changes can push the system past a tipping point.
Interesting.
You see, as the population of balsam fir trees, the budworm's favorite snack, increases,
Right.
the budworm population naturally starts to grow too.
Makes sense.
But here's the nonlinear part.
Okay.
Their reproductive rate explodes way out of proportion to the increase in food.
Oh, wow.
It's like someone ringing the dinner bell and then the budworms throw a massive party.
Yeah. So it's not just a gradual increase, it's more like stepping on the gas pedal.
Exactly.
Okay.
To make matters worse,
Uh-oh.
their natural predators can't keep up.
Oh, no.
It's like a buffet for the budworms with no one to tell them to slow down.
Right.
This all leads to a massive spike in the budworm population, and they end up decimating the fir trees, their own food source.
So they basically eat themselves out of house and home.
Exactly. It's a classic boom and bust cycle playing out over decades,
Right.
impacting not just the forest, but the logging industry and local economies too.
It's all connected.
This brings us to a critical point.
Okay.
Systems are rarely isolated.
Right. It's all connected. Like you can't solve traffic congestion without considering urban planning.
Right.
Build more roads and more people move in and you end up right back where you started.
That's a perfect example.
Yeah.
We often create these mental models with artificial boundaries.
Right.
But the reality is far messier and interconnected.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. We've got feedback loops, delays, nonlinearities. Is there anything else that might surprise us about how systems behave?
Well, have you ever heard the phrase limits to growth?
Yeah.
It's a crucial concept. because it highlights that even in a seemingly booming economy
Right.
or a thriving business,
Yeah.
there are always constraints.
Okay.
Meadows uses the analogy of a rapidly growing company.
Okay.
They might hit limits in production capacity,
Right.
struggle to find skilled workers,
Right.
or even find their accounting systems can't keep up with the rapid expansion.
It's like that Jenga game. You
That's
can keep pulling out blocks and building higher, but there's always a limit.
right.
And if you ignore those limits,
Yeah,
well, you know
right.
what happens. Crash.
A very apt analogy. These constraints often go unnoticed until it's too late,
Right.
leading to those nasty surprises Meadows talks about.
Right.
And these limitations can crop up in the most unexpected places,
Wow.
often with ripple effects we could never have predicted.
This is all starting to feel a bit overwhelming, if I'm being honest. We've got these complex systems, feedback loops, delays, nonlinearities, limits. How are we supposed to make sense of it all, let alone make good decisions?
That's where the idea of bounded rationality comes into play.
Bounded rationality. I'm not going to lie, that sounds a little intimidating.
It's a crucial concept, really.
Okay.
It acknowledges that we make decisions with limited information and within specific contexts.
So we're not those perfectly rational beings that economic models often assume we are?
Not at all.
Okay.
And just as important,
Yeah.
we need to remember that everyone else is operating with their own bounded rationality too.
Right.
This means our decisions are influenced by our own experiences,
Right.
our biases, and the information we have access to at the time.
Okay.
And this can lead to some unintended consequences.
You know, that reminds me of that example in the book about the electric meters in Dutch homes. I
Yeah.
think it was in the Netherlands.
Ah, yes. The ones visible in the front hall, right? That's a great example of how even small changes in feedback can have a big impact.
Okay.
People could see their energy consumption in real time
Right.
and were more mindful of their usage, resulting in significant energy savings.
It's like that old saying, out of sight, out of mind. But in this case, seeing the meter made people much more conscious of their energy use. It's amazing how these small tweaks can sometimes lead to really big changes.
Absolutely.
Wait.
And that's what's so fascinating about systems thinking. It encourages us to look beyond those isolated events and consider the bigger picture, the interconnectedness of it all.
It's about recognizing that we're all part of these intricate webs of relationships.
Yeah.
And that our actions, however small, can ripple outwards in ways we may never fully grasp. It's humbling, really.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's also incredibly empowering because it suggests that even small changes can make a difference.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about delays, nonlinearities, limits to growth, bounded rationality. That's a lot to digest. But I'm ready for more. What other system surprises does Meadows have in store for us?
Well, let's talk about some common patterns that can lead to problems. Meadows calls them system traps.
System traps, huh? Those sound a bit ominous. What kind of trouble are we talking about here?
Well, imagine you're pushing a shopping cart that's got a wobbly wheel.
Right?
You push harder, thinking you're fixing the problem, but it just makes you swerve more. That's kind of what some of these system traps are, like Meadows calls one of them policy resistance. It's when we push harder on a solution, and instead of getting better, things actually get worse.
It's like when you try to pull apart those Chinese finger traps as a kid. The harder you pull, the more stuck you get. So how do we avoid getting caught in those kinds of traps?
Meadows gives the example of Romania's ban on abortion back in the late 1960s. The government wanted to boost the population,
Okay.
but instead of addressing the reasons people might not be having more children, they imposed this really strict top-down policy.
And I'm guessing it didn't exactly go as planned.
Not at all. While the birth rate did initially increase,
Okay.
it led to a whole host of unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm.
The policy backfired because people found ways to circumvent the system.
Right.
There was a rise in unsafe, illegal abortions, leading to serious health complications and even tragic deaths among women.
So pushing on the system in the wrong way created more problems than it solved. It's a stark reminder that understanding the nuances of a system, all those underlying causes and effects, is critical before you start making sweeping changes.
Absolutely. To that point, Meadows contrasts the Romanian example with what happened in Hungary around the same time.
Yeah.
They also wanted to increase the birth rate, but instead of banning abortion, they focused on addressing housing shortages for families.
A much more subtle intervention. Did it work?
It did. By addressing those underlying systemic issues,
Wow.
they created an environment where families felt more supported and more able to have children.
Yeah.
It highlights that sometimes the most effective solutions come from understanding those deeper leverage points within a system.
That's fascinating. So it's not always about making big dramatic changes, but rather finding those pressure points where a little nudge can have a significant impact. What other traps do we need to watch out for?
Another classic one is the tragedy of the commons.
Right.
You've probably heard of this one.
Hmm.
It happens when you have a shared resource. Could be a fishing ground, a pasture, even the internet.
Right.
And everyone acts in their own self-interest,
Yeah.
ultimately depleting or degrading that shared resource.
Right. Like if everyone in town decides to have a bonfire on the same day and uses up all the firewood, individually, it makes sense. Who doesn't love a good bonfire?
Right.
But collectively, it can be a problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Meadows points out that there are a couple of main ways to address this trap. One is to find ways to encourage people to change their behavior,
Okay.
to think about the collective good instead of just their own immediate needs. Think of campaigns to promote sustainable fishing practices or to encourage people to carpool to reduce emissions.
And the other option is?
The other is to change the rules of the game itself.
Okay.
That could mean implementing quotas on fishing,
Right.
establishing regulations on pollution,
Right.
or even creating systems of fines or incentives to guide behavior. It's about recognizing that sometimes individual actions alone aren't enough.
Right.
You need to change the system itself to address the problem.
That makes a lot of sense. What about those situations where we don't even realize we're falling into a trap, where it's more of a slow, gradual decline? Is there a name for that?
As a matter of fact, there is. Meadows calls it drift to low performance.
Okay.
It happens when we gradually lower our standards over time without even realizing it.
Okay.
Think about a company that, to save costs, starts cutting corners on quality,
Right.
or a team that lets deadlines slip because they're constantly putting out fires.
It's that boiling frog analogy, right? The frog doesn't notice the water getting hotter and hotter until it's too late. It's a slow, insidious decline that can be tough to spot until you're already in hot water, literally.
Precisely.
Oh, man.
And then there's escalation, which often plays out in competitive situations.
Mhm.
Think arms races,
Right.
price wars between companies.
Yeah.
Even those arguments that spiral out of control.
Ooh, I've definitely been in one of those arguments where each person keeps upping the ante. Definitely not my proudest moments.
We've all been there.
Yeah.
But thinking in terms of systems can help us recognize those patterns
Right.
and maybe even find ways to de-escalate the situation before it gets out of hand.
So we've got policy resistance, tragedy of the commons, drift to low performance, and escalation. Are there any other traps lurking out there we need to be aware of?
Oh, there are plenty more. There's the success to the successful trap,
Right.
where the winners keep winning,
Right.
creating an ever-widening gap.
Right.
Think monopolies or the Matthew effect. Those with more tend to get more. Then there's the shifting the burden to the intervener trap.
Okay.
That's when we become reliant on quick fixes or outside interventions that ultimately mask the deeper underlying problems.
Give me an example of that one. I want to make sure I can spot it in the wild.
Think of social safety nets designed to help those in need.
Okay.
While they provide essential support,
Right.
they can also create a system where people become dependent on them,
Right.
potentially discouraging them from seeking long-term solutions or addressing the root causes of their situation,
Right.
or consider the overuse of antibiotics.
Right.
It's a quick fix for an infection,
Right.
but it can also lead to antibiotic resistance,
Right.
creating a much larger problem down the line.
It's a sobering thought that sometimes our attempts to solve problems can inadvertently perpetuate them or even create new ones.
It's a difficult balance to strike, for sure.
Yeah.
And then there's the rule-beating trap,
Okay.
which highlights what happens when we create rigid systems with unintended consequences.
Okay, this sounds intriguing. Tell me more.
Imagine a company that implements strict rules about how many customer service calls employees must take per hour
Okay.
to boost efficiency.
Oh.
Sounds reasonable, right?
Yeah, seems like a good way to measure productivity. What's the trap?
Well, if the focus becomes solely on meeting that metric,
Right.
employees might prioritize short calls over actually solving customer problems.
Oh.
They might even find ways to game the system, perhaps transferring difficult calls or rushing customers off the phone.
So you end up with a system that looks good on paper, high call volume, but actually undermines the goal of providing excellent customer service. It highlights how important it is to design systems with those potential loopholes and unintended consequences in mind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just establish rules. We need to make sure those rules are flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances and don't incentivize the wrong kind of behavior.
Okay, this is a lot to take in. It's like we're navigating a minefield of potential problems. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? Meadows offers some solutions, doesn't she?
She does. And those solutions lie in understanding what she calls leverage points, those places where even small interventions can create big change.
Okay.
And one of the most powerful leverage points of all,
Yeah.
she argues, is shifting our mindset, changing the way we think about the system itself.
Oh, I like where this is going.
Yeah.
So it's not just about tweaking the gears or adding a new lever. It's about reimagining the whole machine.
Exactly.
Okay.
Imagine if, instead of measuring our progress solely on economic indicators like GDP, we started prioritizing well-being indicators, things like health, happiness, and environmental sustainability.
Okay.
That would be a paradigm shift, with the potential to transform our entire approach to how we live and organize ourselves.
It's like looking at the world through a new lens, seeing those interconnections and feedback loops that were always there, but perhaps went unnoticed. It's both exciting and daunting to think about how we can use this knowledge to create positive change. But where do we even begin? Where can we, as individuals, have the most impact within these complex systems? So we've identified the traps, we see the leverage points shimmering in the distance, but how do we actually reach those leverage points and make a difference? Give us the tools, oh wise expert.
Well, I don't claim to have all the answers, but Meadows offers some really insightful guidance on this. She talks about how counterintuitive it can be, how sometimes the most obvious solutions are the least effective, and the most powerful interventions involve shifting our perspective, changing the system's goals rather than just its parts.
Okay, that tracks with what we've been talking about, those paradigm shifts you mentioned earlier.
Okay.
But give me a concrete example. How does this leverage point idea work in the real world?
Let's take the example of traffic congestion again. Now, the typical response is to build more roads or widen existing ones. It seems logical, right? More roads, less traffic.
Makes sense on the surface, but we both know it's not that simple, right?
Exactly. That's because it addresses the symptom, the congestion, without addressing the underlying system. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. What often happens is that you end up with what's called induced demand. More roads simply lead to more people driving, and you end up right back where you started, congested.
So what's the leverage point in this scenario? How do we actually get people to drive less?
This is where changing the goals of the system comes in. Instead of aiming for shorter commute times, what if we aim for increased accessibility or vibrant, livable communities? That subtle shift in focus opens up a whole new realm of possibilities.
I see what you mean. Suddenly we're not just thinking about cars and roads, we're thinking about public transportation, bike lanes, walkable neighborhoods, mixed-use development, all these interconnected pieces that contribute to a more holistic vision of what a city could be.
Exactly. And that's the power of changing the system's goals.
Yeah.
It allows us to move beyond those short-term fixes and start thinking about more fundamental systemic solutions.
It's like we're playing a strategy game, not just reacting to whatever pops up, but thinking several moves ahead, considering the long-term consequences of our actions.
I love that analogy.
Mhm.
And it's not just about big picture issues like urban planning systems. Thinking can be applied to our own lives, our relationships, our workplaces. It's about recognizing those patterns of behavior, those feedback loops, those leverage points that exist in every system, no matter how small.
You know, this whole conversation has been incredibly eye-opening, if a bit overwhelming at times. It's made me realize how much I've been stuck in that linear, event-oriented mode of thinking. But it's also incredibly empowering to realize that we're not just cogs in a machine blindly following predetermined paths. We have the ability to understand those systems, to identify those leverage points, and to make choices that can influence the direction of those systems.
That's the beauty of systems thinking. It doesn't offer easy answers or quick fixes, but rather a framework for understanding complexity, for seeing the world with new eyes, and for realizing that we have agency, that even small actions thoughtfully taken can create ripple effects far beyond what we might imagine.
So what does this all mean for our listeners? If we can't perfectly control systems, what does it mean to be responsible participants within them? What small actions can they take to nudge the systems around them in a positive direction?
That's a profound question, and I think the answer isn't different for each of us. It starts with awareness, with paying attention to those patterns, those feedback loops, those unintended consequences that are all around us. Once we start seeing the world through a systems lens, we can start asking ourselves, what role am I playing in this system? Where are the leverage points? What small actions can I take that might create a ripple effect in a positive direction?
So it's about asking ourselves, what system trap do I see playing out in my own life or work, and what leverage point could I influence to change its course? It could be as simple as speaking up at a meeting, changing a habit, or connecting with someone who holds a different perspective.
Precisely. And those seemingly small acts of courage, those moments of awareness, those shifts in perspective, they can have a ripple effect influencing the systems we're a part of in ways we may never fully comprehend.
It's a bit like that butterfly effect, right? The idea that even the smallest action can have far-reaching consequences.
Exactly. And it's not about having all the answers or knowing exactly what the outcome will be, but rather about embracing that complexity, that uncertainty, and realizing that we're all in this together, interconnected in this magnificent, ever-evolving web of life.
Well said. That's a powerful and inspiring thought to end on. A big thank you to you, dear expert, for guiding us through the fascinating and thought-provoking world of systems thinking.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to see the world with new eyes. Until next time, happy systems thinking.